I used to believe that 16 years of dedication would make a company remember my value. But when a young CEO laughed in my face, called me outdated, and suggested I should consider early retirement, I finally understood a chilling truth. They had never truly seen the woman who quietly kept their entire system alive. And when I walked away with what genuinely belonged to me, the empire that had underestimated me began to collapse. Victoria Bennett's laughter echoed through the glass-walled executive office on the top floor. Sharp and cold, as if each sound were cutting into the last pieces of dignity I had brought with me. I sat across from her with both hands resting on a thick portfolio I had prepared for weeks. Inside it were the achievements, systems, projects, and measurable results I had helped create during 16 years at CrownGate Systems. My name is Emily Parker. I am 48 years old, a senior cloud architect. And until that moment, I still believed that if a woman worked hard enough, stayed steady enough, and remained loyal enough, her company would eventually recognize her worth. Victoria looked at me with an expression that blended pity and contempt. Behind her, a framed business school diploma gleamed on the wall like a trophy, proving she had earned the right to judge everyone else. She said that at my age, the company needed hungry young talent, not expensive legacy employees clinging to old methods. That sentence was not merely a rejection of my raise request. It felt like a verdict on 16 years of my life. I had believed I belonged there. I had believed the nights I stayed awake for failing systems, the dinners I missed at home, the emergencies I solved before customers ever knew they existed. All of it meant something, but to Victoria, those sacrifices had become a payroll line item. And I, the woman who had built the foundation of the company's cloud infrastructure, had suddenly been reduced to an outdated component waiting to be replaced. The office looked polished, modern, and powerful. But all I could feel was the humiliation of realizing that the place I had protected for so long had never protected me in return. I tried to keep my voice steady, as I reminded Victoria that the cloud migration architecture I designed had saved the company more than $2 million every year. I spoke about the security framework that had blocked several serious attacks, the threat detection model that had protected contracts worth hundreds of millions, and the infrastructure layers most of the younger engineers used every day without knowing who had built them. Yet the more I explained, the smaller my voice sounded to my own ears. It was not because I doubted my value. It was because I realized the person sitting across from me had never truly intended to listen. Victoria leaned back in her expensive chair, lightly turning a pen between her fingers, still wearing the same CEO smile she used during all-hands meetings when she talked about the company as a family. But when salary, and power entered the room, she did not treat employees like family at all. She said everyone was replaceable, even senior engineers with decades of experience. Then she told me that if I believed I was worth more than what CrownGate was paying me, I should try my luck elsewhere. The sentence landed in that wide office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by modern art and shining glass. But to me, it felt like a door slamming shut. I remembered the 3 o'clock mornings in freezing server rooms, when I was the only person awake enough to keep the platform from collapsing. I remembered the years when Victoria was studying disruptive innovation while I was preventing disasters that could have destroyed the company's reputation. And now I was being treated as a cost problem. Not a builder. Not a specialist. Not the person whose judgment had saved them again and again. Just an expensive woman from an older era. In their eyes, standing in the way of cheaper labor. When Victoria shifted into the artificial tone of concern that managers often learn in leadership seminars, I almost laughed from bitterness. She told me I was good at what I did, and she would admit that much. But I was too expensive. The board looked at a senior architect earning my salary and wondered why they could not hire 2 recent computer science graduates for the same cost. They were younger, more energetic, more familiar with modern frameworks, and according to Victoria, they did not need hand-holding. He sat still, feeling the portfolio tremble slightly in my hands. Through the glass wall, I could see my colleagues bending over their screens, pretending not to listen, although the quick glances and unnatural silence told me they had heard enough. Nothing personal. Victoria said. But to me, everything about it was personal. The soccer games my daughter had played while I handled deployment failures, the debate tournaments my son had attended while I watched recordings later because a customer needed the system restored. The evenings when my husband, Daniel, sat alone after chemotherapy while I was trapped at the office because the company could not wait. Nothing personal. The company had taken time, health, peace, and the softest parts of my family life. And when I asked for an 8% raise, they laughed at me. If you have ever been undervalued after years of dedication, comment number 1, so I know I am not the only one who understands that feeling. In that exact moment, something inside me snapped. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply a silent cord that had been stretched for too many years, finally breaking. I stood, gathered my papers, and for the first time in 16 years, I no longer wanted to persuade the company that I mattered. I returned to my open plan workspace. The kind leadership called a collaboration environment because that sounded more innovative than admitting it was just a crowded desk surrounded by noise, notifications, and half-finished conversations. After 16 years, after a senior title, after the systems I had designed and saved, I still did not have an office. My desk sat between two young engineers fresh out of school. They still called me Emily with a mix of respect and awkwardness, then asked why we could not simply rewrite the entire legacy platform over a weekend. I did not blame them. They were products of an industry so obsessed with speed that it had forgotten durability was also a form of intelligence. On my monitor, messages kept appearing. Someone needed a code review. Another department wanted help with a configuration they had broken. A calendar reminder announced the weekly architecture meeting, where I would once again explain why a solution that looked impressive in a demo might collapse at enterprise scale. Beside my keyboard was a family photo from the previous Christmas. Daniel was smiling tiredly after his second round of chemotherapy. My daughter, Emma, was home from college, her eyes carrying the kind of worry young adults should not have to learn so early because tuition had risen again. My son, Noah, was preparing college applications, though lately he had begun mentioning community college as if it were simply a practical choice. When I knew he was trying not to burden us. Insurance, medication, treatment, mortgage debt, tuition, all of it pressed against my life. And while I was being mocked for requesting a raise, Victoria had just been praised in the company newsletter for buying another vacation home. The unfairness was no longer abstract. It sat on my chest, heavy enough to make breathing difficult. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the small leather notebook I had carried for years. The cover was worn at the corners, and the pages had softened from being turned so many times. But to me, it was worth more than any framed certificate on Victoria's wall. It did not contain company property. It contained ideas I had written during lunch breaks, algorithms that came to me during commutes, security protocols I tested in my home office on weekends after everyone else had gone to sleep. I used to think of those pages as my private intellectual playground, a place where I could solve problems out of curiosity rather than because of deadlines, budgets, or investor presentations. But as I turned the pages, a truth rose in front of me with painful clarity. Many of those ideas had become the backbone of CrownGate's competitive advantage. Intrusion detection models, cloud cost optimization mechanisms, automated threat response systems, the same solutions that had placed Victoria on stages to accept innovation awards while my name appeared nowhere. I had shared them with the company because I trusted the company, because I believed collective success would eventually return to protect my family. I had been painfully naive to believe loyalty flowed in both directions. If this story feels familiar, leave a like on the video, not because I need sympathy, but because invisible workers deserve to be seen. I turned to a page documenting the predictive security framework, the dates written clearly in my own hand. Beneath them were development environment notes, test logs, and references to my private code repository. For the first time that day, I did not feel powerless. I felt the beginning of a different kind of clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally understand that what others have been using was never fully theirs. I took out my phone, logged into my personal code account, and scrolled through hundreds of commits, each one carefully time-stamped. Every line of code felt like a silent witness, proving that the most important algorithms had not been born during company hours, had not been written on company laptops, and had not been built with CrownGate resources. They had been written on my machine, in my home office, on my time, in the thin remaining spaces that an exhausted wife, mother, and professional still managed to keep for herself. The standard employment contract I signed 16 years earlier covered work created during company time with company resources, but it had never clearly covered personal projects developed after hours, on personal equipment, for my own curiosity and needs. Before that day, I had never cared much about that boundary. I wanted to solve problems. I wanted the company to grow stronger. I wanted to prove I was reliable. Now that boundary suddenly looked like a legal wall Victoria had never thought to inspect. An internal email appeared on my computer screen, celebrating CrownGate's revolutionary security platform winning another industry award. In the photograph, Victoria stood in a white blazer, smiling for the camera, speaking about a culture that nurtured innovation. I stared at the image for a long time. She was receiving glory for work that had begun on nights when I sat alone beside a cold cup of coffee, listening to Daniel cough behind the bedroom door. My anger was no longer impulsive. It had become cold, precise, and orderly. If the company had used what belonged to me while refusing to value me, then it was time to examine what truly belonged to whom. I was done being grateful for scraps from a table I had helped build. More importantly, I was done confusing exploitation with loyalty. I thought of my parents, people from a generation that believed if you worked hard and remained loyal, the company would take care of you. My father spent 35 years at a manufacturing plant. He always told me to take care of the company, and the company would take care of me. He believed it until the day the production line moved overseas, and he was called into a small room, handed a severance envelope, and thanked in the driest possible language. The pension he had counted on disappeared when the company restructured and later collapsed. My mother worked as a secretary at a law firm for 40 years, remembering every lawyer's schedule, correcting every document, and keeping the office running like a clock. When she turned 60, they replaced her with a case management software system. They gave her a cake, a gold watch, and escorted her out of the building on the same day. Afterward, she told me that companies no longer cared about loyalty. They cared about quarterly profits. I had heard her, but I had not truly believed her. Some part of me still wanted to prove I could be the exception. I wanted to believe technology was different, that skill and dedication would be recognized fairly, that a woman who was both competent and loyal would not be discarded like obsolete hardware. Victoria's laughter shattered the last of that illusion. I opened my contacts and looked at a name I had saved long ago but never used: Richard Collins, Vice President of Engineering at Brightflow Systems, CrownGate's biggest competitor. He had messaged me several times after a security conference, always respectfully, always saying that experience was not a burden but an advantage. Back then, I had not replied because I considered myself loyal. Now I understood that loyalty to a place that does not respect you is just a locked room you mistake for a home. My finger hovered over the call button longer than I want to admit. 16 years of habit do not vanish in a few minutes. An old voice in my head told me to calm down, not to burn bridges, not to act from hurt, and to consider that Victoria might change her mind. But then another voice, stronger and clearer, reminded me of Daniel fighting illness, Emma working at a coffee shop to buy textbooks, and Noah quietly lowering his dreams because he did not want us to take on more debt. My family did not need a woman who kept swallowing disrespect in order to appear professional to people who viewed her as a cost. They needed me to be brave enough to claim my own value. I pressed call. Richard answered in a warm, steady voice that sounded nothing like the manufactured enthusiasm I had heard too often at CrownGate. I introduced myself and told him perhaps it was time we had the conversation he had once suggested. On the other end, he went silent for a beat, and then genuine excitement entered his voice. He said he had followed my work for years and had begun to think I would never call. He asked whether I was finally ready to explore a place that treated experience as an asset. I looked around the open office, at young faces lowered toward screens, at managers younger than my daughter, making decisions about systems they did not understand. And then toward Victoria's glass office. I told him I was ready. If you want to keep following stories where workers reclaim their value, subscribe to the channel right now. That evening, Richard invited me to dinner at a restaurant in Palo Alto. When I hung up, I did not feel completely free. But I felt something I had not felt in years: control. It was not revenge yet. It was the first deliberate step away from a place that had mistaken my patience for weakness. That evening, I sat across from Richard Collins in a quiet corner of a Palo Alto restaurant, where the tables were spaced far enough apart that no one could accidentally overhear us. Richard was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with eyes that were sharp without being domineering. He wore a simple blazer with jeans and looked like someone who had built systems with his own hands before he ever learned to manage budgets. When he shook my hand, he did not squeeze too hard to prove authority. His handshake was firm, steady, and respectful. He told me he had been watching the sudden leaps in CrownGate's security capabilities for years. And what interested him was how often those advances lined up with project milestones visible on my professional profile. My throat tightened, not from fear, but because after years of being treated like invisible infrastructure, someone had finally seen my fingerprints on the work. Richard mentioned the threat detection system behind the Pinnacle Bank contract and said his own team had tried to reverse engineer the approach for months without fully cracking the core logic. I asked how he knew it was mine. He smiled without mockery and said Victoria Bennett did not have the technical depth to design machine learning models that complex. He had heard her speak at conferences. He said, she was good at fashionable language, weak on substance. Then he added that among real engineers, my reputation was stronger than I realized. I looked down at my glass, trying to hide the emotion rising in me. Recognition that arrives late does not instantly heal old wounds, but it does remind you the wounds were real. For the first time in a long time, I was not being asked to justify why experience mattered. I was speaking with someone who already knew it did. And that simple fact changed the temperature of the entire room. When I asked Richard what he was truly offering, he did not circle around the point. Brightflow wanted me as senior engineering director, responsible for the entire cloud security division. The base salary would be $280,000 a year, with an equity package vesting over 4 years and a team of 8 senior engineers reporting to me. He emphasized the word senior with a small smile, then said the average age on the team was 45. They believed experience produced better code than temporary excitement. Hearing those numbers made my heart beat so hard it almost hurt. It was not only money. It was the possibility of paying Daniel's medical costs without draining our savings. It was the chance for Emma to study without exhausting herself at work. It was the possibility for Noah to choose an engineering school because he loved it, not because it was the cheapest option. But what made me fall silent longest was what Richard said next. Brightflow would put my name on patents, technical papers, and industry interviews. They were not interested in managers taking credit for engineering work. If I had personal innovations developed after hours with my own resources, Brightflow had a transparent intellectual property acquisition process and would compensate them at fair market value. In that moment, I understood that Richard was not simply recruiting an employee. He had done his homework. He knew there were legal gray areas CrownGate had ignored because it had grown accustomed to profiting from my loyalty. I placed my leather notebook on the table and slowly pushed it toward him. At that moment, I did not feel as though I were betraying CrownGate. I felt as though I had finally stopped betraying myself. The difference mattered. One came from guilt. The other came from self-respect. And I had been starving for that for years. Richard turned the pages of my notebook with a care that made my throat tighten again. He did not skim the way Victoria had skimmed my achievement portfolio. He stopped at diagrams, notes, timestamps, test descriptions, and then asked precise questions about architecture, performance, scalability, and legal exposure. I showed him commit histories, private repositories, test logs for my personal system, and emails I had once sent to CrownGate teams proposing the adoption of solutions that were never handled through formal acquisition agreements. Everything I had treated as minor because I believed in teamwork now appeared as a complete evidentiary record. Richard asked how much of CrownGate's security infrastructure depended on those personal projects. I stayed quiet for a moment, then said about 60%. The core threat detection algorithms, the cloud resource optimization system, the automated response mechanisms, all of them had begun in my home office. Richard closed the notebook and looked at me for a long time. He said that was a serious oversight by CrownGate's legal department. I replied that Victoria did not value senior functions, including legal, because she was too busy looking for young talent to replace experienced people. Richard did not laugh loudly. He simply nodded, like someone who had seen that mistake too many times before. We spent the rest of the evening discussing legal boundaries, ownership recognition, compensation structure, deployment timelines, and the team I would lead. For the first time in years, I did not have to shrink my thinking to fit the person listening. I was allowed to speak as an expert and be heard as an expert. That should not have felt extraordinary, but it did. It felt like stepping out of a room where the air had been slowly disappearing and finally realizing how hard I had been trying to breathe. By the time dessert arrived, we had nearly completed a transition plan, strong enough to protect both me and Brightflow. Everything had to be transparent. No company-owned code. No CrownGate internal documents. No confidential customer information. I would bring only what could be clearly demonstrated as personal intellectual property, original algorithms, independent development notes, test models, and concepts CrownGate had never properly acquired through a valid agreement. Richard suggested that an independent legal team review every component before it entered Brightflow's systems. That caution made me trust him more. A company that genuinely respects intellectual property does not encourage a new employee to act recklessly. It protects value through process, not slogan. Driving home that night, I moved slower than usual. The city outside the windows was still bright, noisy, and full of the energy the technology industry worships. But inside me there was a strange quiet. I knew what was coming would not be easy. There would be anger, suspicion, and possibly lawsuits. Victoria would not accept losing the systems that had helped her accept awards. But I also knew I was no longer the woman who had sat in front of her that morning, trying to secure an 8% raise so my family would not sink further into debt. I had seen what the market truly thought my work was worth. I had seen evidence that my experience was not obsolete. It had simply been used for free for too long. Before going inside the house, I sat in the car for a few minutes and looked at the living room light still on. Daniel was waiting for me. I did not yet know where to begin the story. But for the first time in a long while, I could tell my husband that maybe we were going to be all right. That sentence alone felt like a luxury I had almost forgotten existed. 2 weeks later, I placed my resignation letter on Victoria's desk. I printed it on standard company paper, submitted it through the proper channels, gave the required notice, and kept every sentence professional. There was a cold irony in following CrownGate's procedures perfectly, even as I prepared to leave a place that had treated me like outdated equipment. At first, Victoria barely looked up. She was reading email while sitting in a muted video meeting. The kind of multitasking a new generation of executives often mistakes for competence. When she saw the resignation notice, she asked where I was going in a casual voice. I had considered avoiding the truth by saying I was consulting, taking a break, or moving into a different field. But I was tired of protecting the feelings of people who had never protected my dignity. I told her clearly Brightflow Systems. The name made Victoria's head snap up. For the first time, I saw real emotion in her eyes. Not rehearsed. Not wrapped in a CEO smile. It was worry. She said the timing was unfortunate because CrownGate was in final negotiations to expand the Pinnacle Bank security contract. I said I knew because I had built the threat detection model that won that contract in the first place. The room went quiet. I could almost hear the calculations running through her mind. Contracts, systems, customers, replacement capacity, risk. The confidence that had allowed her to laugh at me began to crack. She said we should discuss retention options immediately. perhaps a 15% raise, and even a promotion to vice president level. The saddest part was that the offer would once have meant everything to me. It was more than I had dared ask for that morning. But it arrived after respect had already died. And money cannot resurrect something that was deliberately killed. I told Victoria that Brightflow had offered $280,000. Equity. And leadership over a team of experienced engineers. But I also told her money was not the most important point. What mattered was that they did not see my age as evidence of obsolescence. They saw it as evidence of the systems I had saved, the decisions I had survived, and the mistakes I had paid for in reality rather than learned from slides. Victoria laughed. But this time the laugh had no sharp edge. It was hollow, thin, and slightly unsteady. She said Brightflow was overpaying and would eventually be disappointed when they realized a 48-year-old engineer could not keep up with their development pace. I smiled. Not cruelly, but with the calm of someone who had finally escaped a room where others defined her value. I said we would see who ended up disappointed. My final 2 weeks at CrownGate became strange. Like a play in which every role had suddenly reversed. Managers who had ignored me for years invited me to lunch. Departments that had treated systems like black boxes suddenly panicked and demanded documentation. Younger engineers, including Brian Cooper, the 26-year-old assigned to replace me, looked both eager and terrified as they realized the things they thought ran by themselves had actually been kept alive by years of accumulated judgment. I did not sabotage anything. I did not hide information required for transition. I completed every handoff more carefully than they deserved because my professionalism did not depend on their ethics. At the same time, I preserved every email, every record, every trace showing that CrownGate had used my personal innovations without ever properly acquiring ownership. I left cleanly, but I did not leave naively. That difference was important. The old version of me would have walked out, hoping not to cause trouble. The new version of me understood that refusing to be exploited is not the same as causing trouble. On my final Friday at CrownGate, I shut down my computer at 5:30 in the afternoon, gathered the few personal items left on my desk, and stood for a moment looking at the workspace that had consumed nearly a third of my professional life. I did not cry. Perhaps the tears had dried up the morning. Victoria laughed at me. Or perhaps I understood that what I was leaving was not a home but a cage I had decorated with loyalty. Brian stood beside my desk, holding the transition documents, the stack almost as thick as his forearm. He quietly said he had not realized the system had so many layers. I smiled and told him to always be suspicious of things that looked simple, because usually someone had worked very hard to make them appear that way. When I walked out of the glass building, I did not look back. On Monday morning, I sat in my new corner office at Brightflow. It was not extravagant, but it was quiet. And it had a door I could close when I needed to think. In front of me were 8 senior engineers. The oldest was in his 50s. The youngest was close to 40. They did not look at me like a relic from a previous era. They looked at me like a fellow builder. Someone who had survived enough outages to know which questions mattered before the first line of code was written. We began by rethinking cloud security architecture from the ground up, without rushing after slogans. I felt myself come alive again in a quiet way. Not because my title was bigger or the office was nicer, but because every time I spoke, people actually listened. At the end of the day, I called Daniel from the parking lot and told him things were different now. He was silent for a moment, then said he had been waiting years to hear me say that. I sat there holding the phone, realizing I had been waiting too. 6 weeks later, the first version of the security framework I brought to Brightflow went live for real customers. I still remember standing with the engineering team in the operations room, watching performance dashboards update continuously. The algorithms Victoria had indirectly dismissed as outdated thinking were detecting attack indicators before threats fully materialized. Processing speed increased by 35%. False positives dropped by 60%. The machine learning models I had trained in my home office reached 94% accuracy in predicting attack patterns. No one at Brightflow called it luck. No one folded the result into an executive speech and erased the creator's name. My name appeared in patent filings. I was invited to explain the architecture to sales, legal, and executive teams. Younger employees asked sharp questions, not to prove they knew more than I did, but to understand the system more deeply. I learned from them two newer tools: more flexible automation practices, more modern development habits. That was what Victoria had never understood. Experience does not oppose innovation. Experience opposes reckless haste, disguised as innovation. When comparative data showed Brightflow could outperform CrownGate's best metrics, the sales team could barely contain its excitement. But the most important moments for me were smaller. Emma called to say she might reduce her work hours next semester. Noah sent me a list of engineering schools he loved without adding that he did not want to pressure us. Daniel looked at a new medical bill and, for the first time in months, did not sigh. Professional success, in the end, is not only reputation, it is when your value becomes strong enough to protect the people you love. For years, I had been told indirectly to be grateful for stability. Now I understood that stability built on self-erasure was not security at all. It was slow disappearance wearing a corporate badge. The morning Pinnacle Bank announced it was ending its contract with CrownGate and moving to Brightflow. My phone began ringing nonstop. The first call came from a technology publication wanting to interview the architect behind Brightflow's security breakthrough. The second came from a venture capital firm interested in licensing the threat detection technology. The third came from Victoria. I looked at her name on the screen and let the call go to voicemail. She called several more times over the next few days. Each call close enough to the last for me to know the other side was no longer calm. Eventually, she left a message. Her voice sounded nothing like the one that had echoed through the glass office weeks earlier. There was no laughter, no confidence, no lecture about everyone being replaceable. She said CrownGate needed to discuss consulting opportunities immediately, that the company was prepared to offer a substantial compensation package for my expertise, and that they had made a mistake. I saved the message, not to brag, but as private evidence for myself. Some apologies do not come from moral awakening. They appear only when consequences reach the balance sheet. I did not call back. 4 days later, Victoria stood beside my car in the Brightflow parking garage. She looked tired, her makeup failing to hide the shadows under her eyes. Her hair no longer perfect. I kept my distance and told her that her being there was inappropriate. Victoria did not waste time. She said I had put 180 jobs at risk, that CrownGate was facing an existential crisis because of the intellectual property I had taken. I looked at her, and for the first time, I was not afraid of the person who had once controlled my salary. I saw only an executive finally encountering the consequences of arrogance. The power between us had shifted completely, and we both knew it. She had come not because she respected me, but because she needed me. I told Victoria I had not taken anything that belonged to CrownGate. I had brought my own personal intellectual property, which CrownGate had used for years without properly acquiring. Their legal department had failed to conduct due diligence. Their leadership had failed to care. And she had been too busy treating experienced employees as burdens to notice the company's greatest asset sitting in a cubicle with no door. Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping into something close to pleading. She told me to name my price. Whatever Brightflow was paying, CrownGate would double it, triple it. They could make me chief technology officer, grant equity, give me whatever I wanted. For a moment, I saw the old version of myself, the woman who had once hoped for an 8% raise just to breathe a little easier, who wanted one honest acknowledgement, who still believed the company she had helped build would not turn on her. But that woman was not standing alone in the parking garage anymore. I had passed through humiliation, fear, awakening, and choice. I told Victoria she had once said everyone was replaceable, even senior engineers. I was simply following her business philosophy. Her face went pale, not because my words were cruel, but because they were accurate. I got into my car and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror longer than necessary. In the next quarter, CrownGate plunged. Its stock lost nearly half its value. Technology media called it the mysterious deterioration of a once award-winning security platform. Analysts were more direct. They wrote about the danger of undervaluing experienced talent, losing institutional knowledge, and confusing youthful energy with operational competence. Victoria resigned under pressure from the board. Her glass and chrome empire had begun cracking from the foundation she had once dismissed. The irony was painful, but it was also instructive. Systems fail when leaders mistake presentation for substance. Then the lawsuit arrived. Exactly as I expected. CrownGate sued me for theft of intellectual property, corporate espionage, and breach of fiduciary duty. The accusations sounded enormous, frightening, and surely designed to make me hesitate. But truth has a strange power when it has been documented carefully. My attorneys presented the leather notebook, commit histories, development logs, evidence of personal equipment, after-hours timelines, and emails showing CrownGate had adopted solutions without ever signing proper acquisition agreements. Piece by piece, the record built a clear picture. I had not taken what belonged to them. They had grown accustomed to using what belonged to me without paying the proper price. The case collapsed faster than they expected. The judge dismissed their claims and ordered CrownGate to pay my legal fees. Noting that the company had failed to secure ownership of the innovations it implemented, winning did not feel as sweet as I had imagined. 3 months later, Laura Mitchell, CrownGate's former head of customer service, came to my office. She had worked there for 12 years before being laid off in the cost-cutting waves. We had shared coffee, complained about management decisions, and survived more bad leadership than either of us wanted to count. Laura sat across from me and asked whether my revenge had been worth 180 people losing their jobs. The question hurt more than any legal accusation. I had focused so intensely on Victoria's arrogance that I had not fully looked at the damage spreading outward. I told Laura she had every right to be angry. Then I told her Brightflow had hired 73 former CrownGate employees in the previous 4 months, including nearly the entire customer service team that wanted to come over. I could not save everyone from the mistakes of their former leadership, but I could use my new position to open another door. That became the beginning of something larger than my personal vindication. My conversation with Laura led to Experience Matters, a formal Brightflow initiative designed to recruit, retrain, and create opportunities for older professionals pushed to the margins of the technology industry. We partnered with training organizations to update skills for engineers over 45. We created flexible consulting roles for near-retirement professionals who still had far too much wisdom to waste. We publicly rejected age bias in hiring, not through a polished social media statement, but through targets, budgets, and real authority. 8 months after leaving CrownGate, I received a Lifetime Achievement Award for contributions to cloud security architecture. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience filled with gray-haired engineers and younger developers sitting side by side, I thought about Victoria's comment about early retirement. She had been wrong about me, wrong about experience, and wrong about how sustainable companies are built. We were not legacy employees clinging to the past. We were people who had watched systems burn, repaired them in the dark, and learned that speed only matters when what you build survives the first impact. Later, CrownGate filed for bankruptcy and sold its assets to a private equity firm. The company I had helped grow from a small team into a major corporation disappeared because leadership confused polish with competence and disruption with wisdom. As for me, every time a 50-year-old engineer calls Brightflow to ask whether there is still an opportunity for them, I always say, experience is not a weakness. It is wisdom waiting to be unleashed. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone laugh at your worth. It wakes you up. Thank you for watching the entire video. If this story reached you, please leave one like to subscribe to the channel. And remember that your value does not disappear just because someone is too blind to see it.